In a bustling urban middle school, life buzzed with the usual energy of chatter, laughter, and the occasional scuffle in the hallways. Among the students was 12-year-old Maya Carter, a bright and spirited girl who loved art, basketball, and making people laugh. She wasn't one to cause trouble, but on this particular morning, she found herself at the center of an unexpected storm. Maya had woken up late that day because her alarm clock decided to stop working halfway through the night. Her mom, a nurse working long shifts, wasn't home yet, so Maya scrambled to get ready by herself. When she pulled on her favorite pair of jeans, she noticed they had a small tear near the knee. It wasn't huge, just a tiny rip, but it was noticeable enough to make her pause. Still, she figured no one would care. After all, plenty of kids wore ripped jeans without anyone batting an eye. Grabbing her backpack, she dashed out the door, hoping to catch the bus before it left. When Maya walked into her classroom, Mrs. Harper, her strict math teacher, immediately spotted the tear in her jeans. Known for her rigid adherence to rules, Mrs. Harper wasted no time addressing the issue. "Maya," she said sharply, pointing at her legs, "those pants are not appropriate for school. You know our dress code policy." Maya froze, feeling her cheeks grow warm as all eyes turned toward her. "But I didn't have anything else to wear," she stammered, clutching her books tightly. "It's just a little rip." Mrs. Harper shook her head firmly. "A little rip is still against the rules. You'll need to call your parents and ask them to bring you a change of clothes." The room grew quiet, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Maya felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Calling her dad meant pulling him away from work, something she hated doing. Plus, he lived across town, and getting there would take time. But arguing with Mrs. Harper seemed pointless. Once she made up her mind, there was no changing it. Reluctantly, Maya stepped out into the hallway to use the office phone. As she dialed her father's number, dread settled over her. She knew he'd be upset, not at her, but at the situation. Sure enough, when Marcus Carter answered, his deep voice carried both concern and frustration. "What happened?" he asked briskly after hearing Maya explain the problem. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, tears threatening to spill. "I didn't mean to break any rules." Marcus sighed but reassured her. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll handle this." Within minutes, he was on his way to the school, leaving behind a mountain of paperwork at his law firm. Meanwhile, Maya sat nervously in the principal's office, replaying the scene in her head. She couldn't shake the embarrassment of being singled out or the sinking feeling that maybe this wouldn't end well. As the clock ticked by, whispers traveled through the halls about why Maya had been sent to the office. Some classmates teased her, while others sympathized, saying the rule was ridiculous. By the time Marcus arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone sensed that something big was about to unfold. When Marcus Carter stepped into the school building, his presence immediately commanded attention. Standing tall in a crisp navy blue suit, polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor, he looked every bit the accomplished professional he was. His sharp eyes scanned the hallway, as if sizing up the situation before he even reached the principal's office. Students and teachers alike stopped what they were doing to watch him pass. There was something about the way he carried himself that made people take notice, calm but firm, with an air of quiet authority. Inside the office, Maya sat slumped in her chair, nervously twisting a strand of her curly hair around her finger. When she saw her dad walk in, relief washed over her face, but it was quickly replaced by anxiety. She knew how seriously he took matters involving fairness and respect. "Dad," she murmured softly, standing up to greet him. He gave her a reassuring smile, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Maya," he said gently. "Let's figure this out together." Mrs. Harper and Principal Thompson were waiting in the conference room when Marcus arrived. Both seemed startled by his appearance, not just because of his commanding demeanor, but also because neither had expected such an imposing figure to show up for what they considered a minor issue. Mrs. Harper cleared her throat awkwardly and gestured for him to sit. "Thank you for coming," Mr. Carter, she began, trying to sound professional despite the nervousness creeping into her voice. Marcus nodded politely but didn't waste time with pleasantries. I'd like to understand exactly why my daughter was sent home for wearing ripped jeans, he said, his tone calm yet direct. The question hung heavy in the air, forcing Mrs. Harper to explain herself. She launched into a rehearsed explanation about the school's dress code policy, emphasizing the importance of maintaining standards and discipline. We can't have students coming to school looking untidy or inappropriate, she concluded, folding her arms across her chest as if to signal the end of the discussion. But Marcus wasn't satisfied. Leaning forward slightly, he raised an eyebrow. So let me get this straight, he said slowly. You sent my child home, not because she disrupted class or harmed anyone, but because of a small tear in her jeans. He paused, letting the absurdity of the statement sink in. Do you realize how far away I live? Do you think it's reasonable to pull a working parent away from their job over something so trivial? Principal Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing the conversation spiraling beyond their control. Mr. Carter, we're simply following the rules, he interjected weakly. It's not personal. Marcus tilted his head, studying them both intently. Not personal, he repeated, his voice steady but carrying a hint of skepticism. Then tell me this, how many other students have been sent home for similar violations recently? And are these policies applied equally to everyone, regardless of background or circumstances? The room fell silent. Neither Mrs. Harper nor Principal Thompson had an immediate answer. They exchanged uneasy glances, realizing too late that they were dealing with someone who wouldn't accept vague excuses. For the first time, Mrs. Harper felt a flicker of doubt creep into her mind. Was she being fair? Had she enforced the rule consistently, or had she singled Maya out without considering the bigger picture? As the meeting continued, Marcus remained composed, asking pointed questions and listening carefully to their responses. Maya watched silently, marveling at how her dad managed to stay calm while addressing such a frustrating situation. By the time they left the office, word had already spread among the staff about the intimidating father who had challenged the school's authority. What started as a routine disciplinary action now felt like the beginning of something much larger, and no one, least of all Mrs. Harper, could predict where it would lead. As Marcus and Maya left the school building, a crowd of curious onlookers had gathered near the entrance. Some were parents picking up their children, while others were students eager to catch a glimpse of the man who had confronted Mrs. Harper so boldly. Whispers rippled through the group as Marcus walked by, his expression unreadable but undeniably serious. Maya kept her head down, clutching her dad's hand tightly, feeling both embarrassed and strangely proud. Once they were safely inside their car, Marcus turned to Maya with a gentle smile. "Are you okay?" he asked, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. She nodded hesitantly, though tears still glistened in her eyes. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she whispered, her voice trembling. Marcus sighed and pulled her into a reassuring hug. "You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart," he said firmly. "Sometimes the rules aren't fair, and it's our job to speak up when that happens." Back at the school, however, things weren't settling down quite as easily. Word of Marcus's sharp questioning during the meeting spread like wildfire among the staff. Teachers huddled in small groups, discussing what had happened. Many admired his poise and intelligence, while others felt defensive, insisting that enforcing the dress code was necessary for maintaining order. But one name kept coming up in these conversations: Marcus Carter. Who exactly was he? It didn't take long for someone to dig deeper. A quick internet search revealed that Marcus wasn't just any parent. He was a highly respected civil rights attorney, known for taking on cases involving discrimination and inequality. His name had appeared in news articles, legal journals, and even televised interviews. Suddenly, Mrs. Harper's decision to send Maya home seemed less like a routine enforcement of policy and more like a potential lawsuit waiting to happen. Mrs. Harper herself couldn't stop replaying the meeting in her mind. At first, she had been confident in her actions, believing she was upholding the school's standards. But now, doubts began creeping in. Had she overreacted? Was sending Maya home really worth all this fuss? Worse still, she couldn't shake the image of Marcus's piercing gaze as he questioned whether the rules were applied equally to everyone. For the first time, she wondered if there was truth to his accusations. Principal Thompson called an emergency meeting with the staff later that afternoon. The atmosphere in the room was tense, with teachers glancing nervously at each other as he addressed the issue. "We need to be careful here," he warned, pacing back and forth. "This isn't just about Maya anymore. If Mr. Carter decides to pursue this further, it could reflect poorly on all of us, and possibly the entire district." One teacher raised her hand timidly. "But we've always enforced the dress code this way," she argued. "Why is it suddenly a problem now?" "That's exactly the point," Principal Thompson replied, rubbing his temples. "Maybe we haven't been thinking critically enough about how we enforce it, or who it affects most." Meanwhile, Mrs. Harper sat silently in the corner, her usual confidence replaced by unease. She had never intended to create such a stir, nor did she want to believe she might have treated Maya unfairly. Yet, the more she thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the possibility that her actions had been influenced by unconscious biases. After all, hadn't she let other students slide for minor infractions without batting an eye? Why had Maya's case felt so different? By the end of the day, the tension within the school was palpable. Parents began calling in, demanding answers. Students whispered excitedly about the drama unfolding around them, and Mrs. Harper found herself unable to focus on her lessons, distracted by the growing weight of guilt pressing down on her shoulders. What started as a simple act of discipline had spiraled into something far more complex, and no one knew how it would resolve. That evening, as Maya settled into bed with a book to distract herself from the day's events, Marcus sat at his desk in their cozy living room. His laptop was open, its glow reflecting off his focused face as he typed furiously. He wasn't just upset about what had happened to Maya. He was determined to uncover whether this incident was part of a larger pattern. If there was one thing Marcus knew how to do well, it was investigate. He started by reaching out to other parents in the school community. Using social media groups and email chains, he asked if anyone else had experienced similar issues with the dress code policy. To his surprise, responses poured in almost immediately. One mother shared how her son, a black 8th grader, had been sent home twice for wearing sneakers that were too flashy. Another parent recounted how her daughter, who used a wheelchair, was repeatedly told her skirts were too short, even though they fell below her knees when seated. Each story painted a troubling picture. The dress code seemed to disproportionately target students of color and those from low-income families. What struck Marcus most was the inconsistency. Several white parents chimed in, admitting their kids often wore ripped jeans or untucked shirts without facing any consequences. "It's like they don't even notice," one mom wrote. This glaring disparity confirmed what Marcus had suspected all along. There was more to this than just a strict policy. It wasn't about fairness, it was about bias. The next morning, armed with these accounts, Marcus decided to visit the school again, not to argue, but to gather evidence. He requested copies of disciplinary records related to the dress code over the past year, citing transparency laws that allowed him access. Principal Thompson hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request, but ultimately complied. As Marcus flipped through the documents, patterns began to emerge. Students of color made up nearly 80% of those punished for dress code violations, despite making up only 50% of the student body. Meanwhile, infractions involving white students were often marked as warnings or simply overlooked altogether. Marcus also spoke directly with teachers during lunch breaks, asking them candidly about how the policy played out in classrooms. Some admitted feeling pressured to enforce rules strictly, even when they didn't agree with them. Others confessed they hadn't realized how unevenly the penalties were applied until now. A veteran teacher named Ms. Patel pulled Marcus aside after hearing about his efforts. "I've seen this happen so many times," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "It's always the same kids getting singled out. We need someone like you to shine a light on it." Word of Marcus's investigation spread quickly among the students too. By midweek, Maya noticed her classmates whispering excitedly about her dad's involvement. "Your dad's kind of a hero," one girl told her shyly. For the first time since the incident, Maya felt a spark of pride instead of shame. Maybe something good could come out of this mess after all. As Marcus continued digging, he realized this wasn't just about Maya or their school. It was about challenging a system that failed to treat every child equally. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that change was long overdue. But Marcus also knew that exposing the problem was only the first step. Now came the hard part, holding the school accountable and ensuring real reform took place. And if experience had taught him anything, it was that fighting for justice required patience, persistence, and a willingness to stand firm, even when others pushed back. By the end of the week, the story of Maya and her father's fight against the school's dress code policy had spread far beyond the walls of their middle school. Parents who had once stayed silent about similar incidents began speaking up, sharing their frustrations on social media and at community meetings. What started as a single act of discipline quickly grew into a rallying cry for change, drawing attention from local news outlets and even national platforms. The turning point came when Marcus organized a town hall meeting at a nearby community center. He invited parents, students, teachers, and concerned residents to come together and discuss the issue openly. The room was packed, standing room only, with people eager to share their experiences. Maya sat quietly beside her dad, watching as the crowd buzzed with energy. For many attendees, this was the first time they'd felt empowered to speak out about the inequities they'd witnessed or experienced firsthand. One by one, voices filled the room. A mother named Jasmine recounted how her son had been sent home 3 times in one semester for wearing the wrong type of belt. Each time, she'd lost hours of work to pick him up, putting her job at risk. Another student, a shy 7th grader named Elijah, stood nervously at the microphone and explained that he'd been teased by classmates after being publicly scolded by a teacher for his untucked shirt. "It made me feel like I didn't belong here," he admitted, his voice trembling but resolute. Teachers joined the conversation too. Ms. Patel, the veteran educator who had spoken privately with Marcus earlier, addressed the crowd with quiet conviction. "We all want our schools to be safe and respectful environments," she said. "But we can't ignore the fact that these rules are hurting some kids more than others. It's time we ask ourselves, are we teaching respect or reinforcing bias?" The emotional weight of the stories shared that night left an undeniable impact on everyone present. Even those initially skeptical about the severity of the issue found themselves moved by the personal accounts. By the end of the meeting, there was a palpable sense of unity among the attendees. They weren't just fighting for Maya. They were fighting for every child who had ever felt unfairly targeted by arbitrary rules. Social media played a crucial role in amplifying the movement. Videos from the town hall went viral, sparking discussions across online forums and prompting hashtags like #FairDressCode and #RespectEveryStudent to trend locally. People from neighboring districts chimed in, sharing their own struggles with discriminatory policies. Activists reached out to offer support, while journalists contacted Marcus for interviews. The momentum was building, and it wasn't slowing down. Even within the school itself, attitudes began to shift. Some teachers started questioning whether enforcing the dress code was worth the harm it caused. Others pushed back against colleagues who defended the status quo, arguing that education should focus on learning, not policing clothing. Students, emboldened by the growing movement, began organizing protests during lunch breaks. They held signs reading, "My clothes don't define me," and "Equality starts here," drawing cheers from their peers. Back at home, Maya noticed a change in herself too. At first, she'd been hesitant to talk about what happened, fearing judgment or ridicule. But seeing so many people stand up for her, and for others like her, gave her courage. She started participating in discussions at school, encouraging classmates to join the cause. Her confidence blossomed, and for the first time, she realized the power of using her voice to make a difference. As the days turned into weeks, pressure mounted on the school district to address the growing outcry. Parents demanded answers at board meetings, activists organized petitions, and local leaders called for accountability. The message was clear. This wasn't just about Maya or her genes. It was about creating a fairer, more inclusive environment where every student could thrive without fear of being singled out. And though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, one thing was certain: the community was ready to fight for change. With the community rallying behind him and mounting pressure on the school district, Marcus knew it was time to take the next step. He filed a formal complaint with the school board, accusing them of discriminatory enforcement of the dress code policy. The lawsuit wasn't just about Maya. It was about every student who had ever been unfairly targeted because of their race, income level, or background. Marcus made sure to include detailed evidence: the disciplinary records he'd obtained, testimonials from parents and teachers, and even photos showing examples of clothing that had led to punishments. The news of the lawsuit sent shockwaves through the school and the wider community. Local newspapers ran headlines like, "Parent takes on school over discriminatory dress code," and "Is your child's outfit really a problem?" Talk shows invited experts to debate whether strict dress codes did more harm than good. Social media exploded with opinions, some supporting Marcus's actions while others argued that schools needed rules to maintain order. Regardless of where people stood, everyone seemed to have something to say. For Mrs. Harper, the legal action felt like a direct attack. She had never imagined that sending a student home for ripped jeans could spiral into such a public ordeal. At first, she tried to defend herself, insisting she was only following protocol. But as days passed and criticism mounted, cracks began to show in her resolve. Friends and colleagues stopped inviting her to lunch, and she noticed students avoiding eye contact with her in the hallways. For the first time in her teaching career, she questioned whether she truly belonged in the classroom. One afternoon, after another grueling day of fielding questions from reporters and administrators, Mrs. Harper sat alone in her empty classroom. Staring at the stack of ungraded papers on her desk, she replayed the events of the past few weeks in her mind. Why had she been so quick to judge Maya? Had she let her biases cloud her judgment? These thoughts haunted her, making it hard to focus on anything else. That evening, she confided in her husband, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she admitted. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Meanwhile, Marcus remained steadfast but empathetic. In interviews, he emphasized that his goal wasn't to vilify individuals like Mrs. Harper. It was to hold the system accountable. "This isn't about blaming teachers," he said during a televised segment. "It's about recognizing that policies can perpetuate inequality, even unintentionally. We need to create environments where every child feels valued and respected." As the case gained traction, the school board found itself under intense scrutiny. Parents packed meetings, demanding answers and reforms. Faced with mounting pressure, the board agreed to negotiate a settlement out of court. They proposed sweeping changes to the dress code policy, including clearer guidelines, more lenient enforcement, and mandatory diversity training for all staff members. While Marcus believed these steps were a good start, he pushed for additional measures, such as forming a committee of parents, students, and educators to review future policies before implementation. Throughout the process, Maya watched her father navigate the complexities of advocacy with admiration and pride. Though she still felt nervous walking through the school halls, knowing that so many people supported her gave her strength. One day, a group of classmates approached her, asking how they could help. Inspired, Maya suggested organizing a Dress for Change Day, where students would wear outfits that expressed their individuality while raising awareness about fairness and equality. The idea took off, with hundreds of students participating and sharing photos online. By the time the settlement was finalized, the impact of the movement extended far beyond the school district. Other districts across the country began revisiting their own dress code policies, inspired by the changes happening locally. Teachers started conversations about bias in the classroom, and students felt empowered to speak up when they saw injustice. Though the journey had been challenging, it proved that standing up for what's right, even over something as small as a pair of ripped jeans, could spark meaningful change. And for Maya and her family, it was proof that courage and determination could turn a single moment of unfairness into a catalyst for progress. The settlement agreement marked a turning point, not just for Maya and her family, but for the entire school community. The school board publicly announced the changes to the dress code policy, emphasizing flexibility and fairness. Gone were the rigid rules about specific types of clothing. Instead, the new guidelines focused on practicality and inclusivity. For example, students could wear ripped jeans as long as they weren't excessively torn, and sneakers, once deemed too flashy, were now allowed unless they posed a safety hazard in certain classes like science labs. Most importantly, the policy explicitly stated that enforcement must be consistent and free from bias. But the reforms didn't stop there. The school district committed to mandatory diversity training for all staff members, led by experts in equity and inclusion. Teachers learned how unconscious biases could shape their decisions and explored ways to create a more welcoming environment for every student. Workshops also encourage open dialogue between educators, parents, and students, fostering trust and understanding. It was clear that this wasn't just a quick fix. It was an effort to transform the culture of the school system. As part of the settlement, Marcus requested a private meeting with Mrs. Harper. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to face him after everything that had happened. But deep down, she knew avoiding the situation wouldn't solve anything. When the day came, she walked into the conference room nervously, clutching a folder of notes she'd prepared. To her surprise, Marcus greeted her warmly, offering a firm handshake and a calm smile. Sitting across from him, she braced herself for what might come next. "I'm not here to make you feel bad," Marcus began, his tone steady but kind. "I know you didn't set out to hurt anyone, but I think it's important we talk about what happened, from both sides." He explained how Maya had felt humiliated and singled out, describing the emotional toll it took on her. As he spoke, Mrs. Harper listened intently, tears welling up in her eyes. She realized for the first time just how deeply her actions had affected the young girl. When it was her turn to speak, Mrs. Harper struggled to find the right words. I never meant to embarrass Maya," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I thought I was doing my job, enforcing the rules the way I was told. But looking back, I see now that I should have handled things differently." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I want to apologize. To you, to Maya, and to any other student I may have treated unfairly." Marcus nodded, acknowledging her sincerity. While forgiveness didn't come easily, especially after all the turmoil, he appreciated her willingness to take responsibility. Together, they agreed that moving forward required mutual understanding and a commitment to doing better. Before leaving the room, Mrs. Harper asked if she could personally apologize to Maya. Marcus promised to discuss it with his daughter and let her decide. A few days later, Maya met with Mrs. Harper in the principal's office. It was an awkward encounter at first, with both parties unsure where to start. Finally, Mrs. Harper broke the silence. "Maya," she said gently, "I owe you an apology. What I did was wrong, and I'm truly sorry for making you feel bad about something so small. You deserve to be treated with respect, and I'll do everything I can to make sure no one else goes through what you did." Maya looked at her teacher, surprised by the raw honesty in her voice. After a moment, she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she replied, her words simple but sincere. Forgiveness wasn't immediate, but it was a beginning, a step toward healing and rebuilding trust. In the weeks that followed, signs of progress became evident throughout the school. Students noticed teachers handling discipline more fairly, focusing less on appearances and more on behavior that truly disrupted learning. Conversations about equality and respect became common in classrooms, empowering students to advocate for themselves and others. Even Mrs. Harper seemed different, softer somehow, as she made an effort to connect with her students on a deeper level. For Maya, life returned to a sense of normalcy, but with a newfound confidence. She realized that standing up for herself hadn't just changed her own experience. It had sparked a movement that touched countless lives. And while the journey wasn't over, she felt hopeful about the future, a future where every child could walk into school feeling valued, respected, and free to be themselves. The ripple effects of Maya's story continued to spread long after the settlement was finalized. What had started as a single incident, a pair of ripped jeans and a strict teacher, had grown into something much bigger. A movement that challenged outdated systems and inspired people to rethink how fairness and respect should look in schools. For Maya, the experience left an indelible mark, shaping her into someone stronger, braver, and more determined to stand up for what was right. At school, things began to feel different, not just for Maya, but for everyone. The new dress code policy allowed students to express themselves freely without fear of punishment. Kids who once dreaded coming to school because they didn't have the right clothes now walked through the doors with their heads held high. Teachers, too, seemed more approachable, taking time to listen and understand rather than jumping straight to discipline. Even small gestures, like Miss Patel complimenting a student's unique outfit or Mr. Rodriguez cracking jokes about his own mismatched socks, helped create a warmer, more inclusive atmosphere. Maya found herself at the center of this cultural shift. Her classmates often sought her advice when they wanted to speak out about unfair treatment, seeing her as someone who could navigate tough situations with grace and courage. She became a natural leader, organizing events like workshops on self-expression and panels where students could share their experiences with bias. Though she never imagined being in such a role before, Maya discovered she had a talent for inspiring others, and it gave her a sense of purpose. For Mrs. Harper, the changes were transformative in a deeply personal way. After apologizing to Maya, she made a conscious effort to improve not only her teaching methods, but also her mindset. She attended every diversity training session, asked questions during discussions, and even invited feedback from students about how she could be a better educator. Slowly, the tension between her and the students eased, replaced by mutual respect. By the end of the year, some of her former critics were among her biggest supporters, praising her growth and dedication to change. Marcus, meanwhile, continued using his platform to advocate for equity in education. The case brought him national recognition, leading to speaking engagements and opportunities to advise other districts facing similar challenges. But he remained grounded, always reminding audiences that real progress started with listening to those most affected, the students. He encouraged parents and teachers alike to keep asking hard questions and pushing for accountability, knowing that systemic change required constant vigilance. As the school year drew to a close, Maya stood on stage at the annual award ceremony, accepting a special recognition for leadership and community impact. Clutching the certificate, she looked out at the crowd, her dad beaming proudly, her mom wiping away tears, and her friends cheering loudly. When this all started, she said into the microphone, her voice steady despite her nerves, "I didn't think anything good could come from it. But I learned that standing up for yourself isn't just about you. It's about making things better for everyone else too." Her words earned a standing ovation, but more importantly, they resonated with everyone present. Parents hugged their children tighter, teachers nodded thoughtfully, and students whispered excitedly about ways they could make a difference in their own lives. The message was clear. One person's courage could spark a chain reaction of positive change. Looking back, Maya realized that while the journey hadn't been easy, it had been worth it. She wasn't just a girl sent home for wearing ripped jeans anymore. She was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even the smallest acts of resistance could lead to meaningful transformation. And though there was still work to be done, she felt hopeful about the future. After all, If a 12-year-old girl in torn jeans could inspire a community to rethink its values, then anything was possible.